My work focuses on researching, exploring and searching for visual but also linguistic representations of various manifestations of the human condition, and those are vulnerability, crisis related to acute experiences of corporality, but also human emotionality. I use various media specific to visual arts, photography, drawing, performance art. I explore movement research, but also I use strictly linguistic tools, letters, fragments of letters, words, signs, sentences, and I treat all of them as a very visual and semantic elements of my works, very substantial ones. In my practice, I investigated the relationship between the Polish and English languages, but also the cultural and multilingual context in which I live daily. I function in my work, in the art world and in academia, has caused my artistic research to expand into cross-language experiences, incorporating different languages within it, and hugely broadening my workshop of concrete poetry, visual poetry, but also my way of working with objects. I see visual and substantial aspects of language as a very drawing material. It always has been a structural form for my practice, because everything starts with language. An idea, a sketch, a project record, and what remains for me is the choice of language. In 2014, I created a drawing series entitled Ponglish. The trigger point for this work has become a hybrid of two tongues, Polish and English slang. This circle deals with the phenomenon of contemporary migration and relates to changes into the fabric of my native tongue, Polish, which began to evolve into new forms based on a large number of borrowings from English. And I mean here the UK, US English, but also Australian and Canadian. The series visualizes linguistic collisions and transformations as a process of language development and growth. It's made up of words that gradually change from Polish into English and from English into Polish. In these works, the roots of the English words remain intact, but the endings decline following the rules of Polish grammar. Spelling became Polish in this work, also a prefix changes, which interpolates the word, creating new cross-cultural meaning and eventually producing a third language culture operating between Polish and English. This work creates a type of primer book or a visual dictionary, and based on this very broad research on the Ponglish slang, I also created a game which aims to encourage Polish and English language speakers to get closer to their languages and cultures. I believe that these works emphasize issues related to the impact of socio-political changes that result from migratory movement and which then influence languages, linguistic states, and shape relation between people. In 2007, I became a migrant woman, and as such, I became a part of a widespread social phenomenon. Migration, as I believe, includes not only the mobility of the body, but also the mobility of languages. And in this context, language becomes an ambiguous element that strongly marks an identity. An identity which is, after all, a fluid experience. So on the one hand, in the foreign language, we became strangers to ourselves. We don't recognize ourselves in the language. we cannot find ourselves in it, but rather we learn ourselves, and we learn ourselves in and through this new language. I construct myself in this language. And at the same time, the Polish language has already constructed me. This paradox allows me to create and influence my linguistic identity actively. Taking root in new phrases and words is part of the process of cultural adaptation. On the other hand, I believe a foreign language is the only space to encounter us with others, with someone who also speaks a language foreign to oneself. And in this context, a language builds a shared space, very common space, and we can get familiar with others only in this foreign but also familiar space for us. This shifting between languages is present in my project entitled Habitats, which I developed from 2007. Habitats is a collection of photographs in which I've preserved familiar symbols in order to make new circumstances feel less foreign. These symbols are large format constructions of Latin alphabet letters inscribed into the architecture of my temporary flats. I've taken the photographs for habitats at various stages of my life, on different continents, in a range of countries and cities, and primarily in the rented flats where I've reorganized my life, lived, studied or worked, in places like Poznań, New York, Wrocław, London, Birmingham, Wakefield and Tarset, amongst many others. Each time I built the letters using either the furniture, books or everyday objects bought for the new space, or found there, or the boxes I use for the move there. The aim of this work is to explore the theme of social and cultural fluency and of life in foreign language contexts. I'm very interested in the process of misunderstanding, non-translatability, of searching for familiar touch points to get closer to understanding, to comprehension, to understand a phrase or a word. I think that artistically it's a very capacious, very evocative and fertilizing area. And I address this issue in one of my works entitled A Net of Emotions or Glossary. This project is a light installation, which is designed for a broad, culturally and linguistically diverse audience. The project was presented in the city centre of Wakefield between November 2021 and February 2022, and investigated the conflict between human feelings and the attempt to express their meaning verbally. Its core questions concern aspects of cultural inclusion to ensure that people are seen, heard, and valued through the power of language. The work consists of lead-light plates with engraved names of emotions which don't have equivalents in English. They derive from Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Hebrew, Swedish, Estonian, Polish, and many other languages. Each plate consists the definition of a particular international word, which brings its relation to names of emotions familiar to the English speakers. All of them create a light-up glossary. This public engaging installation highlights the power and importance of multicultural and multilingual communities and society, and explores the idea of inclusion and of otherness and diversity through the recognition of language diversity. I firmly believe that this is also the function of the art, including significance of language in art.
I'm a hybrid creature from the margins, living in the cracks, trying to soften the truth with art and poetry. I often have thoughts for which words don't seem to exist. I also have dictionaries that explain words through words that are not found in the same dictionary. Sometimes I dream that I speak languages I don't know. Other times I can't remember my mother tongue, and all at once life hangs in mid-air. I start writing in one language and end in the other. I constantly translate myself, which means I constantly question myself and everything else. It's a dialectical process, learning and unlearning, a development to more symbiotic views. As Nietzsche said, we must lose ourselves if we wish to learn from the things which are not ourselves. Hope, noun and verb, a word of unknown origin in English, apparently. Oul fosilă. Scoici bivalve, hidre, arici de mare, așchi de silex, fărâme de granit. Un melc întreabă, nu vrei să-ți ghicesc, frumoasă? Ba da, zi-mi, câte sară în mare, cine suntem, încotro ne îndreptăm. Țară mică, de provincie, cu densitatea 5,513 grame pe centimetru cub, turbine eoliene și specii nevii, biserici între blocuri, blocuri între fabrici și fabrici între cimitire, unde verbul a canaliza miroase în egală măsură a resturi umane și succes. I guess it expands my reach, as I can have both the best and the worst of both worlds. Bilingualism is an unstable condition. It gives me an appetite for unexplored tensions, an alertness to anything that could be or could become text. Also, a license to take the risk of being incomprehensible. And, more than anything, an openness to hybrid artistic practices and forms, able to keep the possibility of freedom and renewal alive. Whenever I start writing prose, I end up writing poetry. By the time I get to the end, I lose my interest in telling a story. I start to cut and cut, like Brancusi, the feathers and the scales. English is the global language of business, so efficiency is key. Furthermore, the precarity of cultural workers begets frugality. Somewhere at the intersection, poetry. If this is a story of failure, subversion, or transformation, I can't really tell.
At the end, you handed me an apricot, originally from Asia, after Plinius. 1,000 years later, I smashed stone with stone on the block's stairwell. The words leaned arbitrarily to the left. 1,000 years later, flowers still blossom before leaves, the only gesture in a city extinct.
So Object Stories was my doctoral thesis project that I started in the University of Westminster. And it really started from my mother's pajamas. And this was like in between a move that I'd been doing, moving from London to Wales, and just was going through my wardrobe as I was, in the process of moving again, and found this pair of pajamas. And it was something that was, kind of really commonplace, but it started to really kind of ask the question of where did these pajamas come from? So this was part of her wider migratory wardrobe that she bought for herself from Hong Kong in her mid-20s, going to the UK. So this was one of the first times that I'd really had a direct conversation with her about these pajamas and about her migratory experiences. And it was just a really enlightening conversation. It was one of the first times that we'd really spoken about this. And then I started to really kind of think about the potential of everyday things and everyday objects to narrate that sense of ambition and agency and stories, and thinking about that being narrated from the position of British Chinese women. So from this point, I started to kind of wonder what might be at the bottom of other British Chinese women's cupboards and wardrobes that had been forgotten. So the project in itself involved 2 generations of British Chinese women, and that was really centered on material objects and material things, and thinking about how those material objects become material worlds and also become, kind of mementos of embodiment and embodied stories. I devised 8 months of art workshops that became this bilingual art school that was all about that was really kind of centered on narrating the stories of the objects through making. So I started to collaborate with a women's group up in Haringey Chinese Community Centre in London, and also collaborating with 2nd generation women as well, and really asking the women what things are important to them, what's meaningful, what's significant. So as a way to kind of narrate that sense of internal kind of subjectivity in how one might situate their sense of identity, their sense of belonging, and how that's negotiated, as a woman of Chinese heritage born in the UK. I think about, the knowledge production through museums, through galleries, and the material culture and histories that is kind of telling, and who is that for? So I think all the objects is situated as a counter narrative kind of to that, right? So I think in that way, there's, the material object negotiates this visual culture, this visual language that our identities are so much kind of situated in, against, and amongst, and between, and how do we make space within that? So I think that this idea of language and how do we speak about ourselves, that is from ourselves, for ourselves, to ourselves, is absolutely fundamental. So this was a collage that one of the women in the women's group made, and she described this collage And she titled this as, you know, this is my manifesto that my rocks will become diamonds. And we have this kind of swirling of these kind of, these glittering kind of diamonds and rocks that like land upon a hand. And I just thought it was just such a beautiful and poetic way to think about one sense of agency that escapes that linguistic barrier. And again, we have this kind of winding of kind of hands that are kind of like circling, that sense of effort and kind of persistence in that way. So I think the visual language in this way just opened up that sense of possibility to be otherwise, that isn't necessarily just strictly framed within the social political reality, but rather we enter into another possibility of how else might we narrate ourselves.
I think on the one hand, you speak about these kind of found objects in the domestic space that carry with them going to be memories of the diaspora and across generation. These are the object that became sort of the vehicle, this kind of flashpoint, it sparks conversation about maybe like family oral histories, conversation around identity and belonging, and maybe perhaps about displacement as well, perhaps about loss, but also about joy perhaps. But then these objects are also not just simply being found, these objects also carries a generative language, right? And you would talk about the process of making, right? This project also kind of guide the collective efforts in creating new languages to talk about our shared stories and to kind of give new meanings and new narratives to perhaps identity, to the sense of place, to a sense of home that may otherwise be lost elsewhere.
And I think thinking about the generative language really kind of resonates, and it reminds me of the feeling in holding the workshops for the second generation, because this was probably back in 2018. And I remember that in holding the workshop, it was very, there was just a sense that everyone really wanted to talk. And that was really palpable, that was really significant. And it kind of, and I think it kind of offered that space and that opportunity for feelings and thoughts to be shared within a collective. So just thinking back to my collaborations with the Haringey Chinese community group and the women's group there. And I really felt this pressure to deliver the art workshops completely in Cantonese. And all my art school training is in the UK with an anglicized tongue. My emotional language is within anglicized terms. And so there was this real kind of brick wall for me in terms of how do I facilitate and deliver and hold space in my mother tongue of Cantonese, but I have no knowledge of it. So that was a huge kind of gulf in that way. And I remember one of the women could see that I was really struggling. And she just said to me, why don't we hold these as bilingual sessions? And any words that we don't know, we'll put it on the board. Any words that you don't know, we'll put it on the board. And we'll just use this as a language kind of learning space. And it completely blew my mind. And it was such a beautiful suggestion. And it completely opened up that space into this kind of bilingual art school then, right? And it completely kind of leveled out that that kind of plane of learning and co-learning and co-making in that way. And so that was so significant. But I think thinking back on it now, that difficulty was actually just generative, right? That difficulty pointed towards a wider possibility of how it could be otherwise. So in the collages, they would create these kind of fantasy kind of narratives, around their sense of self and identity. We just accessed different ways of talking about ourselves. And also just a sense of humor.
Yeah.
That was something that was really distinctive, was just how hilariously funny all the sessions were and how much fun everyone had.
This is such a great stories to hear from you about your experience in the workshop. And I'm just, again, like you say, you love the suggestions of why don't we just make this workshop as a bilingual space where we kind of teach other languages, but also we collaborate over our making. That already taking place in this kind of collective setting where maybe there's no monolingual sort of kind of, there's no way that a monolingual space can kind of really hold the whole space and hold everyone the stories, right? Or perhaps there needs to be the tension. There needs to be a negotiation between different languages. And that's maybe how we found ourselves in that space. So I think there's, on the one hand, I love how there's kind of a suggestions to not smooth out these kind of differences and not smooth out these tension, but rather to use this as an opportunity for imagination, negotiation, and creation.
Before I come to the question about translation, what you said about different modes of language and how that becomes reimagined through the diaspora reminds me of two pieces of work. So I remember there was a certain moment whereby in the women's group, particularly, she was a Vietnamese woman, and she was talking about, that experience of fleeing and that trauma and that difficulty, and where does one kind of situate that historical kind of narrative and that hardship. And what do we do with that pain? And there was this particularly kind of this pivotal kind of conversation that she kind of said this. And then there was another woman who said, we can't look into the past, we have to look into the future. And so what was really interesting kind of about these two positions was that it felt like it was these two positions of navigation or negotiation. It was a conflict of positions, in terms of how do we orientate our sense of self and subjectivity within the diaspora. And what do we do kind of within that? And what's interesting was how their art making and their objects kind of reflected that. So I think that this element of kind of fantasy also comes from that, this kind of managing of one's pain and one's suffering. Also at the same time, to make space for one sense of agency, that I can reimagine, that I can define my identity on my own terms without it being projected on me. So I think, that's thinking about language through making language, through the material object, that becomes their way of asserting themselves through visuality. And I think, coming to your point about translation, I think what was difficult is translation, particularly within emotional histories in that way. I just remember kind of working with my Cantonese tutor, and there were certain things I wanted to say, and he would say, well, you'd say it like this, and then I would say, but that's not what I mean. And he was steering me. You would say, you just, and then I had this feeling of, okay, so would I just not feel that then? Because I knew what he was saying to me, but I also knew that wasn't what I mean either,
Right.
And so that was really interesting, just in terms of just encountering the limits of language and the way it frames emotional geographies. And it kind of steered me into thinking about the emotional geographies that are occurring and happening in the women's group as well, and how we are kind of circling that. But I think also there is a real desire to be heard and to be seen across the two generations, and and I feel there is there's a lot to be gained in the distance between things, that kind of imaginative distance that making allows, or an object might allow, that perhaps kind of just a purely kind of linguistic retelling might struggle to kind of get at. So I think about translation kind of in that way, I suppose, like translated and facilitated and filtered through the object, through the making, as in lieu perhaps of linguistic translation.
I absolutely love what you said about how, like at the end of the project, you realize there is this need and urgency for spatial practice in the British Chinese diaspora, particularly for these British Chinese women across generation. And because that really, to me, spoke back to what I've been thinking all along throughout the conversation, which is in this project, I really see how language making practice through the language of the object, the visual language of the objects, either it carries memories, trauma, loss, or fantasy, right? This language making practice is a world making practice, right, in this project. And I just absolutely love about how you end with, again, like, the gesture tour, engaging and thinking with that distance, that untranslatability, that the impossibility to find equivalences or impossibility to make claims about either sort of kind of similarity or equivalences. And I love the fact that, because I think so much of what you said, what I'm thinking in my head was, because in that distance, the reason why it's so important to keep that distance and to kind of find that distance and to kind of hold that distance is because that distance is a livable space. That is a space where diaspora lives in, right? We all live in that space in between, and that is a livable space.